I'm Steve Lee. I'm an alcoholic. And boy, I'm so grateful to be here with you guys tonight. I've had such a reflective day, though it's been a hugely busy day. But anytime I come upon an anniversary, I can't help but reflect back over the years and so many people that have played an important role in my sobriety and my recovery. And I just want to echo back to Butch what he said, because he's such an important part of my life. And as he said, we are good friends, we are old friends, but we're close friends. And close friends are hard to come by. I've got some others on here tonight, and I'm grateful to see some friendly faces. I tell you that I will probably have to scroll from screen to screen for a little while just to see if I can find someone I can trust to stay awake and act interested for a little while. But because I need that kind of validation. But you know, it's such an interesting time, as Butch said, for us during this pandemic, and to begin to communicate virtually and to be together. One of the pluses is to get to visit with people all over the world, frankly, and be together. And that's one of the great things. One of the downsides is not to be able to really feel that energy that we often feel one with another when we're in the room, but we replicate that as best we can under the circumstances. And the thing I've discovered, though, for us, and I think we're kind of fortunate in Alcoholics Anonymous, and it's not limited to us, but it's certainly available to us, that that our message doesn't change during these times, whether that be the times of the pandemic, during times of social unrest, during times that people are struggling sometimes occupationally, financially, even in their health. But our message and our primary purpose does not change. And that gives me a focus every day when I get up, to know that while there may be many things on my plate today, that primary focus is to stay sober and help other alcoholics. It's great. And I've come in and visited a couple of the previous meetings, and it's been terrific. You guys have had some great folks. You said, Teresa, what a mouthful that was, the topic, and it is. It's a big idea that self-examination, prayer, and meditation, when logically related and interwoven, form an unshakable foundation for life. Because who would want to spend all the time and energy we do to form a shakable foundation? You know, who would want to do everything that we do here in Alcoholics Anonymous to have something that's kind of rickety, that is going to collapse under any strain? I will tell you, during this time, I talked to a friend of mine earlier today, and we've seen, and perhaps some of you have, some people struggle during this time. And I said, you know, if there's a crack in your spiritual boat during these times, it is going to show itself, and it's going to take on water. And so it's been more important perhaps than at any time in my time in AA to have this unshakable foundation, something I can rely upon. And so what I hope to do over the next little while is them have value, but taken together and logically interwoven, that's a different experience. And it's sort of like diet and exercise, right? You can diet or you can exercise, but when you do both, the impact is going to be significantly better than either of those individually. And so I want to touch base on self-examination. I want to touch base on prayer, and I want to touch base on meditation, and see how those come together. And they do tend for us to come together to be logically related and interwoven in the 11th step, in some combination of the 10th and 11th step. Those things begin to intersect with each other. And it was news to me early on in my sobriety when I'm sober a month or two or three. I've on this day, on June the 30th of 1989, was the day before I actually went into a treatment facility. My wife and I spent this day with our daughter Abby, who was 5 years old at the time. And then I headed off to this treatment facility. And somewhere, and I didn't go to get sober, but I went to fulfill my obligation to the legal system for the conviction of my 6th DUI. But somewhere in that treatment experience, somewhere when I was in there and going out to meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous and people were bringing them in, somewhere in that time, I identified with the fact that I had the relationship to alcohol that I heard the men and women of Alcoholics Anonymous talking about. I didn't know it before I went in there. Before I went in there, I would have told you, and it would have been true to an extent, that I had alcohol-related problems. I understood that I drank and had problems related to that. I got 6 DUIs. That is tangible. I've got police reports to identify that I have alcohol-related problems. But it wasn't until I had been sober for a little while and beginning to go through the process of the steps, and I'm easing up between that 3rd step prayer and the beginning of the 4th step inventory in our book. And I read that it says that being convinced that self in its various manifestations is what had defeated us, we looked for its common manifestations. That's the examination of self on which I began in that 4th step inventory. It's the next line that says resentment's the #1 offender and that it destroys more alcoholics than anything. But I had not recognized, and it's an important sentence for me to contemplate and give thought to, is am I convinced that self is what has defeated me? Self in its various manifestations. Because where I am there in the book, looking at that, it has spent the last few pages, 60 through 63, providing a host of illustrations of self. It talks about self-pity. It talks about selfishness and self-centeredness. It talks about self-reliance. I can add self-righteousness, self-justification, a million different words that have the prefix self attached to them. And these are all manifestations of self. And when I go into that self-examination in the 4th step, this fearless and thorough self-examination, I'm going to look to see where self shows up in the relationships of my life, in my fears, and in my conduct. Self. And I will tell you, until I got there, I didn't realize that self is what had defeated me. Alcohol didn't defeat me. Alcohol got me to Alcoholics Anonymous, but self is what put me in touch with alcohol. Self is the problem. And you know, that 3rd step prayer talks about the fact, and I immediately identified in the 3rd step prayer where it says, that I'm asking God to release me from the bondage of self. But for years, I interpreted that as self being held hostage. When in fact, what I'm being told there is self is the hostage taker. Self in its various forms are what are keeping me in bondage, the authentic me in bondage. And in many ways, I view that self as my defects of character. And my defects of character, which are blocking me, which are keeping me from being my authentic self. That pride, that gluttony, that envy, that jealousy, that sloth, that greed, those are all things that hold me hostage, and they show up. It's almost like they're a gang that have taken me hostage, and jealousy and envy will hold me for a couple of days, and then they'll say, hey, our shift's over. Greed, how about you come in here and watch him for a while? Then greed shift is over, and they'll bring in, hey, how about sloth? Come watch him, sloth. Y'all don't have to do anything. Just hang out for a while. And I don't recognize this. Certainly, I go through life asleep to the fact that I'm being held hostage to self, to these variations and manifestations of self that are blocking off who I really am. And that self-examination that begins in the 4th step but continues for a lifetime, and is revisited in the 10th step and revisited in the 11th step. Those are, it says, are the means by which I'm going to face and be rid of those things in myself which have been blocking me, holding me hostage, blocking me from the sunlight of the Spirit. So when I arrive at the 10th step, and it is my belief that when I begin going about the process of amends, in truth, I believe steps 9, 10, 11, and 12 all begin simultaneously. Certainly when we're going through the steps, we stop and have the conversation, and they're numbered for a reason. And this is just my point of view. But I know when I get to the 10th step that it says I commence this new way of life as I clean up the past. So I don't wait till I make all my amends to begin cleaning up my new mistakes, because I can make a new mistake on the way to my first amends. And I'm just supposed to stay current at that point. And in that 10th step, as I arrived there in the book Alcoholics Anonymous, I'm encouraged to continue to look for selfishness, dishonesty, resentment, and fear. I'm encouraged to continue to do virtually everything I have done up to that point. And then I get up to the 11th step. And the 11th step, where I am introduced, certainly in Alcoholics Anonymous and going through the process of the steps, I've been encouraged many times to pray. I don't wait till the 11th step to pray. I've been asking for some things all the way through these steps, right? In the 3rd step, I give myself to this power. In the 4th step, I ask God to give me pity, patience, and tolerance. I gladly grant a sick friend. In the 4th step, in the sex conduct, I ask God to turn my thoughts to relieve me of these thoughts. And then I turn my thoughts to someone I can help. I'm asking God all the way through these steps for power I don't have to do something I can't do. And then I get to the 11th step, and to my knowledge, it's one of the first times that I'm asking God for direction, for intuition. Now the channel's cleaner. It says now I'm arriving there, and that's the point at which I begin to start paying attention to my intuition. And I want to back up a little bit and tell you what, because this is such a challenge for me. I was so glad, Lisa, to hear you read from Appendix 2, because Appendix 2 in our book, Spiritual Experience, has been one of the most pivotal pieces for me. Because when I first got to Alcoholics Anonymous, I wouldn't hold hands and say the Lord's Prayer. I wouldn't, in my big book, I went through the big book and marked out with a magic marker everywhere it used the word spiritual experience or spiritual awakening. I had such a prejudice against that language, and it made me so uncomfortable. And I used to say, with my sponsor Frank's approval, I blacked those things out. But Frank told me over the years that it wasn't with his approval, but it was with his knowledge that I blacked them out. And I wrote above, everywhere in my book it said spiritual experience or spiritual awakening, I wrote above it personality change. Because I was willing to have a personality change long before I was willing to have a spiritual experience. And Frank said, Steve, you're hung up on language, and I want you to have an experience, and I don't care what you call it. And he said, a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. But see, I was locked up again by my view. And I'm not seeing in our book where I'm given so much room. Our book says that we set aside any prejudice we may have against spiritual terms. And I get to determine what they mean to me. I get to make stuff up in AA. You're giving me real latitude to use these terms and me decide what they mean for me. Now, what I can't do is decide what they mean for you. But I love having that room, and that gave me permission to stay and hang out so I could go through the process. He said, what I want you to do is go through these steps and what you believe about God, how you relate to God, how you describe that experience with a God of your understanding will present itself to you. And what we're doing in AA, I believe, again, this is my language, not necessarily the books and not necessarily yours, but what I do is describe my experience as best I can. And my experience is I don't find God in Alcoholics Anonymous. I become conscious of his presence. And the 11th step really drives that point home, because at the 11th step, I'm trying to build upon this conscious contact with God. God has been there all along, but I've lacked the awareness and lacked the contact. I was blocked off from the connection to this higher power. And what I'm doing through the process of the steps, and when I get to the 11th step, I'm encouraged through prayer and meditation to improve my consciousness of God, to build upon a God consciousness versus a self-consciousness, which is how I arrived at Alcoholics Anonymous. I get there and I'll tell a couple of stories. Some of you have who know me on here have heard me tell a couple of these till I'm sure you're tired of it, but I can't help it. It's what molds my experience. And I wouldn't hold hands and say the Lord's Prayer. And a man came up to me after the meeting one day, and he said, Steve, what's the problem? Why won't you do that? Why won't you pray? And I said, I don't want to be a hypocrite. And I was serious. I said, I don't know what I believe, and I'm not just going to hold hands and sing kumbaya with the rest of the campers, because that's what you guys are doing. And this guy had heard my first fifth step, and which included multiple DUIs, car wrecks, infidelities in my marriage, drunk at the hospital when my daughter was born, stealing time and money from a family business, and an assortment of tacky, tawdry things that many of us have done. And he said, but hypocrisy, that's where you draw the line, huh? You've done all of that stuff, but I'm not going to be a hypocrite. And he said, I got good news for you and bad news for you, man. And I felt a little condescended to. And I always say, if you're new in AA and you feel like you've just, somebody's been condescending to you, it's because somebody's just been condescending to you. And he said, I got good news for you and bad news for you. And I said, I'll play. What's the bad news? And he said, the bad news is hypocrisy is way down your list of problems. And you might ought to address them in the order in which they will kill your ass. And I said, what's the good news? And he said, the good news is there's room for another hypocrite and alcoholic. And see, for me, that's good news for me today, because I don't have to be perfect to be here in AA. I don't have to get perfect to connect with a power greater than myself. In fact, it is my very imperfection. And one of my favorite books, and I know my buddy Butch and I were given this book by a dear friend, The Spirituality of Imperfection, has been a wonderful book for me over the years. And so I'm arriving here though with this kind of stilted approach to prayer and meditation. I'd never meditated. So now I'll land up at this 11th step, and I want to talk about that prayer and meditation a little bit and how these things end up being interwoven. The 12 and 12 says prayer is the raising of my eyes to God. That's a pretty simple approach. Emmett Fox talks about the fact that prayer should be understood as including any form of communion or attempted communion with God. Any form. So that doesn't matter if I'm running down the street, if I'm in the shower, if I'm reading a book, that if I stop and I am making an attempt to commune with God. That is a form of prayer. He says the highest of all forms of prayer is contemplation and meditation. So it's interesting to me how Emmett Fox there and our 12 and 12, to bring it back to conference approved literature, intersect prayer and meditation. We often talk about the prayer of St. Francis in the 12 and 12, but that comes under the conversation in that step about meditation. Bill writes in the 12 and 12, what about those of us who, it says that many people show up there having had some experience in the religion of their choice with meditation. It says, but what about those of us who haven't had that, who don't know how to begin? What about the person who doesn't know how to get started with this meditation? And Bill says, well, let's start with a really good prayer. And I guess he offers the prayer of St. Francis as a really good prayer, and encourages me to read each line slowly and contemplate what is there. And you know, one of the things I don't do anymore, I used to a lot, I just don't debate with anybody about anything in Alcoholics Anonymous, because everybody gets to navigate their own way. And I don't know what number you put in front of some stuff, and we'll argue whether something was a 10th step or a 4th step or a 10th step or an 11th step. And boy, all I can tell you is what a high quality argument that is, because if I'm taking the action, I get uninterested in what number is in front of. If I'm taking that spiritual action, this is not a chronological, numerical life we're in. It is a spiritual program we're in, and there are no numbers. I understand why the steps are in order. Don't misunderstand me. What I'm saying is, if I'm taking a spiritual action, I'm taking a spiritual action. And what I am encouraged to do when I land at that 11th step is to engage in, how often do we hear somebody talk about the 10th step and incorporate into that conversation the end of day review that is over technically in the 11th step? Am I going to haggle with that person about what numbers in front of it, or am I going to encourage them and congratulate them for being willing to take that action? Dude, as I tell somebody, for those golfers that are on here, if you're playing golf, if I'm playing golf with you and we make the turn and I'm 2 under par, don't start screwing with my swing, okay? Don't tell me that I need to make a change in that swing. If somebody's getting the results out of prayer and meditation and Alcoholics Anonymous that they want, I'm not stopping them and giving them lessons. I'm saying, hey, tell me what you're doing, man. If that's working, I'd love to hear more about it. And there's so much room for us to find our way. But it does give me, it says it would be easy to be vague on the matter, but here's some things you might want to try. How about in the morning, I ask God, I invite this power in that I don't have to do something I can't do, to divorce my thinking from selfish, dishonest, self-pitying motives. All that's saying is move that out of my vision so I can look at the day not clouded through those things that color the way I see the world. What if you could move those things over? And what would I do if I weren't afraid? What would I do if I weren't selfish? What would I do if I weren't dishonest? And I don't have the power to move those things out, but I can ask God to shield me from that while I look at the day ahead. And when considering my plans for the day, why not jot a few things down and take a look at that? And then I am moved toward that meditation, right? It says and here's the thing, I spend, my days look different a lot of times. I will tell you what I do on awakening. What I do on awakening every day, 95% of the time, is jot down a couple of things I'm grateful for. Then I jot down anything that I might be afraid of that day, anything that feels kind of heavy that's in my way today, that I'm dreading or anxious about or uncomfortable about. It might be work related, it might be AA related, it might be family related, but if something's in my way, I jot it down and I ask God, I invite God into that. That's my fear part of the inventory, that and self-examination. And then I consider my plans for the day, and I write 2 or 3 things down that I'm going to do for the day. And then I do some reading, and then I write down a few things about what I read. Now, I didn't always do that, but I used to ask some of the men I sponsored to do it. If I sponsored you as a new guy, I would ask you to do that for 30 days because it would kind of help me, and send it to me. And it would help me get to know you, right? And and now about 4 years ago, I was sponsoring a new guy, and I was asking him to do that. And he got real excited. And he said, man, that sounds great. He said, so you do that. And I went, well, I do now. And so for the last 4 years, I have done that virtually every day. And that's the value of sponsorship. That's what they'll teach you, right? And he moved me quickly from from teacher to student, which is really where I need to be. And then I get to this meditation, which always seemed kind of odd to me. And Teresa, I haven't paid attention to my time, so just hold your hand up when I got 5 minutes, would you? And I'll come to a screeching halt, I promise, on time, mid-sentence. But this meditation was something that in my language I struggled with. And I had ideas about it, even though I had read in the book where Bill has given me a pretty easy starting point. I think Bill was primarily coming from the perspective of that contemplative meditation. That was a more Western approach to meditation. Let me sit around and think about some stuff. That's really all that is. Let me sit quietly and think of something that I want to be maybe the focus, or I want to take into my day and thoughtfully contemplate that. But then I'm hearing about the Eastern meditation, which is maybe like emptying out your mind and a host of things. And anyway, I was struggling, and I know Butch has heard me tell this story many times. I go to an AA conference about 15 years ago now, and Howard P. from Arizona was there, and Howard, who passed away just over a year or so ago, and I went up to Howard. He was a devoted practitioner of meditation. And then went up to Howard and I said, Howard, I'm struggling with meditation. And I'd love to see if you could offer me some help. And he couldn't be more excited. And he said, let's go to my room. And we went to his hotel room. And we walk in the room, and he turns to me and he says, okay, Steve, he said, what are you doing now? And I said, well, I'm really not doing anything now. And he just cackled and rubbed his hands together, and he said, oh, I see. He said, your problem's not technique, it's commitment. He said, you're not struggling with meditation, you're not meditating. He said, are you willing to struggle? He says, because in order to struggle, you've got to create a time and space for that struggle to begin. He says, your problem is discipline. It's not problem, not that you are struggling with meditation, you are struggling with the commitment to meditate. And that's where he had me, and that's what our book says, right? Our book says that we are an undisciplined lot, and we let God discipline us in this simple way. And discipline, as it's talked about in our book, isn't a form of punishment. Discipline is adopting a committed approach. For those of you who may be in the martial arts, you can adopt one of several different approaches to the martial arts. There are different disciplines within that. And so Howard wasn't telling me what position to get in. He wasn't telling me how to meditate. He was saying, how about carving out a committed 5 minutes a morning and see what happens in that time? And that's what has changed over time for me is the commitment. What I do in that time varies greatly. I still struggle with meditation, but I'm struggling with it. And the truth is, I don't struggle anymore because I'm unconcerned. I'm less concerned than ever with what happens in that space. Because here's what I found to be true for me. I believe that the discipline has proven more important for me than what happens in that time. I believe the discipline is in itself an act of humility. I believe the discipline is in and of itself, as that prayer that many of us have seen says that, God, I don't know what you want, but I believe my desire to do it pleases you. I believe me carving out a little time, I don't think God needs my time. I think I need that conscious contact. And that's what that is. And then I will wrap up here by saying that when we talk about this prayer and meditation, and sometimes we're talking about it on awakening, and sometimes we're talking about it when retiring at night, yet 98% of this relationship with God goes on during the day. 98% of this, I have to ask myself, how am I going through the day? And the book says, reminding ourselves many times each day, thy will not mine be done. I'm no longer running the show. How often do I do that? I had a guy that I was sponsoring, and we were talking in the mornings, and he was saying, man, he said, Steve, I'm getting up, I'm doing the prayer and meditation. He said, but by 10 a.m. at work, and it was a tumultuous time in his work life. He said, by 10 a.m., I'm just totally, wrapped around the axle and anxious, and I've just lost everything that I left the house with in the morning. And I said, well, let's do this. What we did was for a work week there, I said, set the alert on your phone, and I'll do it on mine, that 58 minutes past every hour, the alarm went off. And we would stop at 58 minutes past the hour and take 2 minutes to invite God back in, to say, oh yeah, just to remind myself, thy will not mine be done. Just to consciously connect with God in a way that says, I'm starting to take over again. God, let's come on back in. Give me a little help. Let me recognize that thy will not mine be done. And it was amazing. Now, that's not the kind of thing I would want to do on an ongoing basis, because it might be too effective and might help me too much. But we did it. We did it for that couple of weeks. And I will tell you that I'm much more often today than ever find myself during the day, particularly if I'm starting to get a little worked up about something, when fear shows up. And boy, fear's what shows up most on me. I'm not a yeller or screamer, usually. I'm just a guy that'll get blocked off by fear of something. And I'll do just what our book says back in the 4-step inventory. I'll say, wait, I'm living on a different basis. I forgot I turned my will and my life over to the care of God. I forgot.
Did he get stuck?
It's about our more religious members, and I'm not one of those, but call it a God consciousness. And that's what I realized today is that in AA, I'm trying to move from a self-consciousness to a God consciousness, from being not through an act of will, but through going through the process of the steps. The last thing that I'll say, and I just say for some of you have heard me say this before, but
Steve, you got until 50.
From an AA speaker is I'll be brief and I'll end with this. But how much time, Teresa?
You actually have like 10 more minutes.
Oh, then I won't use but all of them.
Yeah.
Then it says, but the thing that we have intuition, right? The book begins to tell me in that 11th step, when I'm doing that prayer, that I come to rely on this intuition. It says we will get the intuitive thought or idea because the channel is clearer than it's ever been. And it says I begin to rely on that intuition, and it tells me right up front that I'm going to make some really big mistakes in doing that. But here's the thing, I've been making some really big mistakes already. So why don't I start making mistakes by trying to trust that intuition rather than not trust it? And here's what I would say, that when we get to Alcoholics Anonymous, we often hear people tell, when I'm the newcomer, somebody telling me, Steve, your first thought's always wrong. First thought wrong. You can't trust your thinking. And that's probably right when I first get to AA. But I believe if 10 or 15 or 20 or 31 years later, if that was still true, wouldn't that be too bad? And here's what I would say has happened in reverse. It is now less likely that my first thought is wrong. It is now more likely that I will shout down the intuitive voice, that I will hear the intuitive voice and not trust it. And the example I will tell you is Butch, it's when I was flying up to Toronto to the ORC, the first time I ever came up there. That's 15 years ago now, 16 years ago, and I was excited to come. I mean, number one, it's a big deal, which made me think I was a big deal. And so I packed my best stuff and headed to the airport to go to Toronto to spread the good news. And I'm boarding a plane in Nashville. And as I'm getting on, and the plane was going to go to Detroit, and in Detroit, I'm going to change planes to go to Toronto. As I'm getting on that plane in Nashville, there was a woman in the gate area just sobbing unconsolably and talking to the gate agent. She was holding a small child in her hand. And I get on the plane. It was a smaller regional jet, 50, 60 people on it, whatever the number is. And the flight attendant came on the plane and she said, there's a woman out here whose brother has been critically injured in a car accident in Detroit. She's trying to get to Detroit to be by his side. Would anyone be willing to give up their seat? And immediately, intuitively, I knew the right thing to do is give up my seat. But I started thinking about it. And I thought, well, wait a minute, they paid for my plane ticket. I didn't pay for it. Well, if I get off this flight, I'm not going to get there in time to do what they invited me to do. My God, the ORC could crumble if I don't get there in time to talk. What those poor folks in Canada do if they don't hear from me. And just thinking through, and as I'm thinking, they closed the door, nobody gave up their seat, and we took off for Toronto. That Friday night, I'm standing up there in front of whatever that is, 2,500, 3,000 people. And as I'm looking out over there, I knew the man they thought they invited would have given up his seat on that airplane. That I had now flown intercontinental to talk about the principles of Alcoholics Anonymous rather than take the opportunity to practice them when the opportunity presented itself. And I will tell you that happens in small ways all the time. And I believe now part of my challenge, if I'm current, if I am in prayer and meditation, if that channel is clear, if I'm getting that intuitive voice, I made a decision then to follow that intuitive voice. Sometimes I make terrible decisions, but like I said, I was making them already. Now the mistake I'm going to make is be first thing. So what I would say in the final closing is that the great news the 12 and 12 gave me, one of the great lines that helped me, was after all this conversation I've given you, after everything that's written in the big book and everything that's written in the 12 and 12, it says, but in the end, it's essentially an individual adventure. And that's what this spiritual adventure is for us, that each of us gets in his own language, from his own point of view, navigate through the process of these steps to establish a relationship with this higher power, and then to approach that power through prayer or meditation in whatever form we find most effective. And I'm grateful for that. It's given me great comfort. I am a guy that believes 100% that I'm either connected or I'm not in any given moment. And I'm connected more often than I've ever been. And usually the way I get connected with God is to be connected with you guys. The poem I always end with is from a man, Mo H, here in Nashville, that passed away in 2003. And he said, I sought my God I could not see. I sought my soul eluded me, but I sought my fellow man and found all three. That's been my experience in Alcoholics Anonymous. You guys have been so kind to pretend to listen to me tonight. Thanks so much.